The daughter who returned not to inherit, but to remember, reclaim, and redefine the legacy she was never meant to be part of. Seoul had transformed in the decade Han Sojin had been away. Its soul remained the same, ever bustling, a city that thrived on relentless movement, but to her it had become a stranger cloaked in familiarity. Towering steel giants now overshadowed the buildings she once passed daily, and the air held a weight that whispered forgotten fragments of her youth. The city hadn't just changed, it had absorbed the echoes of her absence, and now those echoes greeted her with every breath. From her apartment window, Sojin watched the city unfold below her. Neon lights flickered like old memories, vivid yet out of reach. The crowds moved with purpose, unaware of the woman who watched them from above, disconnected and adrift. Seoul had never felt like hers. Even during her childhood, it was merely the setting for her family's expectations, their cold rituals, and her quiet rebellion. Now it felt like a cage built from past choices. Coming back had never been part of her plan, but the past had a way of reaching across time, dragging her back when she least wanted it. The call from her mother hadn't come with urgency or sentiment. It had arrived softly, like a gust that stirs dust in a long-abandoned room. There had been no warmth in the voice that summoned her, no attempt at apology, only a subtle finality, as if the years had washed away the space for reconciliation. And yet, there was something beneath the words, something elusive, a trace of emotion too faint to name. Her decision to return was instinctual, almost mechanical. It wasn't longing that guided her, nor guilt. It was the gravity of obligation, the unspoken weight that family imposes even after years of silence. Her mother's message hadn't asked questions or offered reasons. It merely pointed her toward the house she had spent so long avoiding, the place where her father's presence lingered in every crevice, even in death. The family home remained as imposing as she remembered, a place too grand to be comforting. As a child, she had wandered its cold hallways like a ghost in her own life, never quite belonging. Her father had built the house to reflect his stature as a monument to legacy, ambition, and control. But he had not built it for love or laughter. Rules were etched into the walls. Silence lived in its corners. It had always been more of a stage than a sanctuary. Even after his passing, the atmosphere remained unchanged. His name still shaped the air within those walls, woven into every portrait and artifact. He had founded a company that brought the family wealth and prestige, but he had also built a framework of expectations too rigid for Sojin to inhabit. In time, she had grown to despise the image he had tried to mold her into. His death offered no liberation, only a shift in pressure from presence to memory. The company, like the house, had endured. Now it was Junsok, her younger half-brother, who carried its weight. Where Sojin had resisted, he had complied. He was the ideal heir shaped by discipline, driven by legacy. Watching him rise in their father's shadow had confirmed to Sojin that she had never belonged. She had left, built her life elsewhere, and found peace in anonymity. No spotlight, no expectations. But the past had its own rhythm, and the present had called her back. Junsuk might have taken the mantle, but there were cracks beneath the polished exterior of the family. Madame Lee, her stepmother, still occupied the house like a queen in a crumbling palace. Their relationship had always been distant, governed by civility and suspicion. Madame Lee had never welcomed Sojin and had never sought closeness. Her cold eyes had always looked past her, as though Sojin were merely a remnant of a previous life, not a part of the one she tried to preserve. That strained coexistence had been bearable only through distance. Now there was no distance left. The house stood before her like a sealed memory, daring her to re-enter. The gates groaned open as she approached. Familiar scents, the faint sweetness of jasmine and the musk of aging wood drifted into the air. The house loomed like a sentinel from another era, its windows like watching eyes. Inside, it was as still as a mausoleum. Servants moved in silence, their faces unreadable, shaped by years of observing without comment. The marble floors glistened under dim lights, the staircase still wound upward like a ribbon of ambition, and the air was thick with unspoken things. Each room she passed whispered reminders. The dining room still bore the echoes of formal meals, where conversation had been sparse and calculated. The library, lined with books her father claimed to love, had been more his throne than a place of learning. The study remained untouched, a shrine to decision-making and legacy. It all felt preserved, embalmed in time. At the top of the stairs, she glimpsed Junseok. Taller now, broader, more composed. He stood still facing the window, as if he too sought a moment of detachment. She did not speak or call out. The years had not bridged their differences, and neither had tried. Instead, she passed him by like a breeze, heading for the room she had once called her own. The room stood hollow, a space that had forgotten its former occupant. Dust sheets clung to forgotten furniture, and the air was stale with disuse. This had never been a sanctuary, it had been a chamber of survival. Still, here she was, seated once again at the edge of the same bed, the city lights flickering beyond the window as if reflecting her own restlessness. In that silence, the past clung to her like a second skin. She had thought leaving would be enough to sever the invisible threads of expectation and duty, but now she saw how deep they ran. They were not bound by place but by blood. No matter the years, the distance, or the decisions made in defiance, the ties to her family remained. And so she sat, not with hope or regret, but with resignation. She had returned not to repair what was broken, but to witness what remained. The days that followed moved slowly, drawn out like winter shadows under a pale sun. The house functioned as it always had, efficient, orderly, and devoid of warmth. Meals were served at their usual times, conversations when they happened were brief and formal, and every footstep echoed against stone and silence. It was a home that had learned to live without the need for affection. Seojin began to observe, not from curiosity but necessity. Time in that house demanded awareness. Beneath the surface calm was an undercurrent, something unspoken but tangible. Junsuk was present but elusive, often away at the office or locked in their father's study with Madame Lee. Whispers moved between servants, half-glimpsed gestures and sidelong glances suggesting that her return, though wordlessly accepted, had unsettled the household's careful equilibrium. It was in the quiet moments that she began to feel an invisible shift, as though her presence had reactivated something dormant. The company her father had built, Li Huan Group, was not merely a business, it was a dynasty, and dynasties did not tolerate unknown variables. Sojin, though long absent, remained one such variable, an heir by blood, if not by will. Her return, whether intentional or not, made her part of the equation again. The weight of inheritance loomed large over every conversation, every gathering. Her father's will had yet to be finalized, or more accurately, parts of it remained sealed, contested, or deliberately hidden. That became clear when the family lawyer came and went without ceremony, and when Madame Lee's posture turned increasingly measured and wary. Junsuk remained polite and distant, but something in his gaze had changed. No longer indifferent, but assessing. Seojin had no interest in the company. That much she had decided years ago, and nothing in the sterile boardrooms or the pride with which her father once spoke of quarterly earnings had ever moved her. Yet being in the house again, under the same roof as those who had long tried to erase her, forced her to reconsider her silence. Power, in this world, was not merely about wealth, it was about visibility, influence, control. Madame Lee remained inscrutable, but her actions grew telling. Meetings were held behind closed doors more frequently. Trusted advisors came and went, not with the usual openness, but with hurried discretion. Rumors reached Sojin like distant thunder of restructuring, of clauses in the will that could shift holdings, of assets being quietly reassigned. She wasn't meant to know these things, but she heard enough. It became clear that her return had disrupted a succession plan carefully curated without her in mind. Still, she said nothing. Her silence became her armor. The more she watched, the more she understood how fragile the facade of harmony was. One afternoon, she wandered into the old greenhouse, long forgotten and tangled with ivy and dust. It had once been her mother's haven before she died, a small rebellion of life and color amid the cold geometry of the estate. Standing there among the broken pots and overgrown vines, Sojin remembered the one place where her father's voice had never followed. That memory, untouched by legacy or grief, steadied her. She began to go out more. She walked the city streets, reconnecting not with people, but with solitude. Seoul offered anonymity, a kind she had grown to cherish. But even in the city's vastness, she began to notice eyes that lingered too long and cars that idled one block too close. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. Someone was watching. Whether it was the family or the company's internal machinery, she couldn't say. But in returning, she had become a piece in a game she had never agreed to play. Then came the day when the lawyer returned with an envelope sealed in wax. He handed it to her with no explanation, only a faint nod. Alone in her room, she opened it and found not a statement of inheritance, but a letter written by her father dated only weeks before his death. It wasn't tender or apologetic, but it held something unexpected: acknowledgement. He had written of regret, not for his choices, but for his limitations. He had known she would never become what he envisioned, and in some strange, cold way, he respected her for it. What struck her most was the final sentence, his admission that in her refusal to be shaped by him, she had proven herself more resilient than he ever was. He had left her nothing tangible, no stocks, no properties, no title. But he had named her as a trustee for a foundation she had never heard of, one that operated beneath the company's main branches, dedicated to art, education, and healing. It was small, quiet, almost hidden. That night, Sojin didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, the letter beside her, and weighed its meaning. It was not a victory, not a concession. But it was a path. She made her decision before dawn. The next morning, the house stirred as usual, unaware. Sojin packed lightly and left without announcement. She did not go far, only to a quiet office on the outskirts of the city, where the foundation's name hung in modest silver letters. There, in a space that bore no trace of legacy, she found something she hadn't expected: purpose. Weeks passed. She worked quietly, rediscovering parts of herself lost in years of avoidance. The foundation became her own kind of legacy, not of control, but of impact. She answered with no board, no bloodline. She built something not from rebellion, but from intention. Junseok, she heard, continued to lead Liwon Group. Madame Li remained in the mansion, her empire intact. But the tension eased. Perhaps in claiming her own place, Sojin had removed herself from the inheritance they had feared she would contest. But she had not surrendered. She had redefined. And though the house on the hill remained behind her, its shadow finally loosened its grip.